It's February, which means Valentine's Day is right around the corner. And since in real life I'm about as romantic as Jo March, I've been thinking more about my favorite literary couples and my favorite books about romance, as opposed to what I'm gonna do on the 14th with my non existent real life boyfriend. Anyway, that got me thinking about the Jane Austen novels, and I started to think about what order I would read them in if I could go back and do it all over again, and what I might recommend to someone who is getting ready to read them for the first time. So that's what I'll be talking about in this video. So the first Jane Austen novel that I read was Pride and Prejudice, and I think that that was a good choice for a first Jane Austen novel. It has all of the things that make Jane Austen likable, I think. The romance, the compelling female characters, the beautiful time period aesthetic, and it's lacking in most of the things that make Jane Austen difficult or uncomfortable for modern readers. Like, for instance, there's no huge age gap like there is in Emma or Sense and Sensibility. There's no cousin marriage like in Mansfield Park. Yeah, those are things in Jane Austen. It's not all Regency era tea parties. Actually, I guess there is technically cousin marriage in that Elizabeth's cousin proposes to her, but they don't actually get married. I definitely think that Lizzie is a very compelling character that modern women are very likely to identify with in comparison with some of Jane Austen's others that are a little bit more of their time. Her relationship with Darcy is probably one of the most romantic Jane Austen relationships, one that tends to capture modern audiences' imaginations even almost 200 years later. The story has its twists and turns without being overly complex. Yeah, I would say if you're new to reading Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice is an excellent choice for a first Jane Austen novel, and I definitely don't regret that that was my first one. The second one that I read was Emma, and I did not like Emma very much at the time. I read it for school in college, and I think the fact that I was being made to read it and wasn't really very enthusiastic about it was probably a big part of the problem. Because after reading Pride and Prejudice, I enjoyed it, but I didn't go out and read all of Jane Austen's other novels. I wasn't super enthusiastic about it in that way. It was a book that I had read and enjoyed, and then I moved on. The obsession over it actually didn't come until 2020, but we'll get to that later. In any case, when I first read Emma, I felt a little bit lost in terms of, like, everybody in my class kept saying, oh, it's so funny, and I'm just like, what's funny about it? And I do get it now. I have reread it and I have watched the movie version that came out in 2020 and I see the humor now. But I think that sometimes Jane Austen's particular sense of humor, it's so interwoven into the cultural expectations of the time, the way that society functioned at the time, and she has just this very dry, sarcastic kind of humor that if you don't understand everything that's going on and you're not looking for it, it's easy to miss. I wish that I had waited to read Emma until I was a little bit more familiar with Jane Austen's work, her sense of humor, and just generally the culture and society of the time period. So would I recommend Emma as your first Jane Austen novel? Probably not. Just because I had such a bad experience with it the first time that I read it, that's not something that I would personally recommend. But maybe if you're already familiar with the time period and so you know, when someone is acting in defiance of social norms and what the expectations were at the time, and if what you're looking for is a book that is lighter and funnier as opposed to more serious. The third one that I read several years later in the spring of 2020 was Sense and Sensibility. And I loved Sense and Sensibility. That's what got me back into reading Jane Austen's novels. That's what really got me addicted. I would not say that it's my favorite by any means, but I really did enjoy reading it. And I think that it was... So early 2020 was a time when everything was in lockdown. I was quarantined in a studio apartment by myself, and I was looking for escapism, and Sense and Sensibility was escapism. I would say that it's actually pretty average as a Jane Austen novel. It's not the funniest, it's not the most romantic, it's not the most serious, but it does touch on all of those things. It was actually the first of her works to be published, and you can kind of see traces of what would eventually become all of the things that Jane Austen is known for in it, like the relationship between the sisters, The way that the romance kind of unfolds, the complex family dynamics, and the humor that comes from awkward social situations and the kind of satire and whatnot. The only thing that I would caution against as far as reading it as your first one, first of all, there is a big age gap between two of the characters that end up getting married, and it's one that I think would bother a lot of people today. It would have been considered pretty acceptable at the time, I think, for a girl in her very late teens to be marrying a man in his mid-30s, but that is gross by modern standards, so just beware of that. And then also, the romance in general kind of falls flat compared to some of the others. There is no Mr. Darcy in this one. I would say that the bond between the two sisters is really at the heart of Sense and Sensibility more so than any of the romance. Personally, I don't mind that, but if you're looking for really swoon-worthy romance and dashing romantic heroes, there are others that do that much better. Northanger Abbey is a really short, lighthearted, fun book to read. I definitely found that to be very enjoyable. I would say it doesn't have as much substance as some of the others. It's not really deep and meaningful and thought-provoking. It's very satirical. Jane Austen is satirizing other work of the time, particularly Gothic novels. So you kind of have to understand that in order to understand what she's doing with Catherine and Isabella and their novel reading obsession, and how the narrator at the beginning says that Catherine was not really born to be a heroine. She's an ordinary girl from an ordinary family. In any case, I think that it would be perfectly fine to read Northanger Abbey first or early on, but I don't know that it would be my top recommendation for which one to read first. I think that would still be Pride and Prejudice. The one that I would most strongly advise against starting with would be Mansfield Park. I actually really like Mansfield Park. I like the main character. I don't like the romance. But the thing is, most people do not like Mansfield Park. Most people do not like the main character. Most people, including myself, who likes the book, do not like the main romance. It's one of her longer novels. It's one of the more serious ones. It addresses more serious themes than some of the others, and it doesn't have a whole lot of likable characters. I sympathize with Fanny Price, the heroine of Mansfield Park. I feel bad for her. But I think she is, compared to, say, Elizabeth Bennet or Emma Woodhouse or Catherine Morland, she is more difficult for most modern readers to connect with, and she marries her cousin. Yeah, so I definitely would recommend saving Mansfield Park for later, once you've figured out if you like Jane Austen and you've decided that you want to read all of her work. And then that takes us to Persuasion. Persuasion is Jane Austen's last completed novel, and it actually was published after her death. Personally, I love Persuasion. It's my favorite Jane Austen novel, even more than Pride and Prejudice. I know, right? Shocking. But in any case, because it was written so late in her career, and because it is a little bit different from some of the others, the characters are older, the love story is, I would say, a little bit more mature, I wouldn't recommend starting with it. Persuasion is the story of a girl who turns down the love of her life because her family tells her he's not rich enough. And then he shows up about a decade later, very rich and still very single, and she is still very single, but because of what happened to them earlier on, it takes them a long time to figure out that they're still in love with each other. I find the heroine of Persuasion to be pretty relatable, and the romance to be basically on the same level as Lizzie and Darcy in terms of how much I enjoyed it. I'm also really glad, though, that I saved Persuasion for last. Not just in a save the best for last kind of way, although I am glad that I ended it on that one and not, say, Mansfield Park, even though I didn't dislike Mansfield Park, but also just in the sense that it's different from her other work. It's more mature, I would say. The characters are older. The love story is deeper. It's more bittersweet, more complicated. It has a happy ending. Jane Austen always has a happy ending, but it's just different. And it felt right to read it last. So that's, I guess, what I would recommend doing as far as that one goes. What are your thoughts? Are you reading Jane Austen's novels? Have you read them? What order did you read them in, and did you think that that worked? Feel free to leave a comment down below, and if you liked this, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I post twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, classic literature, and a lot more.